Welcome to the Slidecast on Chapter 1 of Mary Beard's book on Pompeii. I'll also try to get the Slidecast up for Chapter 2 very soon. I know we're discussing it this week on Sunday. In Chapter 1, Beard lays out the history of the city, and by history of the city she means a little bit the physical city, but much more the people who founded it and lived there in the first few centuries. To do that justice, she needs to begin with the history of the entire Bay of Naples. There were small native Iron Age communities in the region of Campania, but they left little evidence of their presence. So Beard begins with the Greeks. It's always that way in classics. The Greeks come first. They had been exploring and starting colonies in the rest of the Mediterranean in the 8th century, and this is when they show up in southern Italy. They start at the island of Ischia, just off the coast of the Bay of Naples, but they soon found a city at Cumae, on the western edge of the Bay of Naples. This is where Daedalus is supposed to have flown to when he escaped from Crete. Because I'm an unabashed lover of maps, I include a beautiful one here from a wonderful book entitled The World of Pompeii that was edited by Peter Foss, a Gusty and a classic major who graduated in the mid-80s and is a wonderful Pompeian scholar. Here we can really see the topography, the flatness of the territory surrounding Vesuvius, and the mountainous areas east and south where modern Sorrento is perched. This map also shows you the aqueduct that led from the mountains to the Roman naval port at Misenum, remember, where Pliny was commander. If any of you have ever read Robert Harris's wonderful historical novel, Pompeii, you'll realize that this is the aqueduct that features so prominently in the story. And if any of you get over to the Bay of Naples and have an extra day, you can visit near ancient Puteoli the giant underground holding tank for that aqueduct. It is known as the Piscina Mirabilis, the wondrous swimming pool. And after that, you can stop nearby at the volcanic area known as the Solfatara and walk around the still smoking, steaming pits, which emit a strong sulfury smell. Anyway, back to Cumae. It's a beautiful site, high on the cliffs over the sea. I once snuck into the site with a few students, and we hung out on these temples under a full moon until we started getting worried that they might have guard dogs that they turned loose at night, so we quickly scrambled back over the fences. This city dominated the local inhabitants and had control over the other Greek cities that were founded here, including Misenum, Puteoli, Neapolis, which became Naples, and Herculaneum. Eventually, the Greeks run into conflict with the Etruscans, who are expanding from their power base north of Rome. And both of them are eventually superseded by the Samnites, who are a tribe of fierce mountain dwellers speaking the Oscan language and living in south-central Italy. They sweep down from the mountains and take over Campania by the end of the 5th century BC. So what does this mean for Pompeii? There were found in the early levels of the city fragments of Greek pottery, a column that looks Etruscan, and Oscan inscriptions. We will probably never know who was responsible for the foundation of the city, but in its first 3 to 4 centuries, it's a very mixed place, involved heavily with Greeks in trade, having aspects of Etruscan religion, predominantly speakers of Oscan, and later they will become increasingly Roman and speak Latin. I show you this next slide mostly because I want to talk about the circuit walls, but notice in connection with our discussion in the slidecast from last time, the dates of the digging. In the last 40 years, only 2 small blocks, the green and the purple, from the entire city have been newly excavated. Back to the walls. One of the puzzling mysteries about the early history of Pompeii was that they seemed to have constructed walls around the entire circuit of the city very early on in the 6th century BC. I did a little more digging, pun intended, into the archaeological evidence for the walls, and of course it's more ambiguous than the archaeologists let on. I have never dug in the field, so I sometimes feel at a real disadvantage in reading their reports, but they clearly did not unearth all the way around the city a wall that undoubtedly belongs to the 6th century. They are not even sure whether it might have been 6 to 9 feet in height, or maybe just 3 feet, though what 3 feet of wall would do for you I don't know. But they seem pretty sure that they see enough traces of this early wall at enough points around the city to say that it follows the line of the later wall that we see on the site now, and that accounts for roughly an area of 160 acres. So what's so mysterious? Well, namely, what would the 6th century city have looked like with that much space walled in? There couldn't have been that many people. Was it heavily agricultural? Did they envision a city of a certain size and then expand into that boundary over the next 700 years? To add to the mystery, the evidence of early buildings oriented in line with the streets of 79 AD suggests that the later street pattern may have followed a much earlier grid. To me, this sounds like what Greek colonies liked to do when they laid out towns with a complete grid at the foundation. And I wonder if early Pompeii was heavily influenced by their Greek neighbors. Had Greek help, or was itself Greek? Unless they dig up better early evidence, like a Greek town charter, it will remain a mystery. From the 5th century on, the population was most probably a remnant of the Samnites, who had come down from the mountains and become dominant in the Bay of Naples. As a result, their language, religion, culture, and ethnicity was primarily Oscan, and it would remain that way for several hundred years. Although the Romans expanded their control over the peninsula and defeated the Samnites, the Pompeians became close allies of Rome, fighting on their side in war against Hannibal and generally doing quite well as Rome grew. We can see an interesting piece of evidence for their Oscan identity with the inscription that Beard mentions, the one which accompanied the sundial set up in the bath by a Pompeian magistrate. So clearly, Oscan was still the language of power and communication when this inscription was first erected. You can see here how strange the letters look. It was modeled on the Etruscan alphabet rather than the Roman. The inscription is more intriguing still when we think about the time that it was set up, just at that point when the Roman dictator Sulla had resettled Pompeii as a Roman colony and put several thousands of his soldiers there. Sulla's son had led an attacking Roman force during the Social War against Pompeii. Here you can see the evidence of ballista holes in the north wall of the city. To try to clear the wall of defenders, they would fire either iron bolts or stones or lead shot with a ballista. Here you see a reconstruction of one and the iron projectiles that they would fire. Anyway, Sulla eventually resettled many of his veterans in Italian cities, and here you see a map of those cities that were forced to accept soldiers. This probably meant giving over land, houses, and political power. Estimates for the number of soldiers who settled in Pompeii range from 2,000 to 5,000. But then you would have to add in their dependents as well, family members and slaves. It would have been such a huge disruption that scholars, not seeing signs in the archaeology of such a disruption, have sometimes assumed that most of the soldiers would have been given farms outside the city walls. This may be true, but some of the townspeople must have lost their property, and as far as we can tell, no Oscan names show up among the elected officials for the next 20 years or so. So there was a definite loss of political power. Beard, I think, underemphasizes what a difficult time and what a wrenching change it must have been. This recreation of Pompeii as a Roman colony definitely hastened the demise of Oscan and further Romanized and Latinized the local populace. In that light, the sundial is particularly poignant, proudly inscribed as it is in Oscan, which will soon be pushed out by Latin, and done by an Oscan official who will never hold office again. At the same time, it commemorates one of the benefits of becoming Roman, namely the technological advances that come with Rome, which had themselves imported their first sundial just 80 years before this. And the Pompeians had been enjoying the benefits of living in the Hellenized world of the growing Roman Empire for some time now. One of the chief examples of old Pompeii that Beard focuses on is the huge and sumptuous House of the Faun. You can see a plan of it here, and the faun who danced in the pool of the atrium and gives the house its name. This house, as we see it now, was probably built in the early 2nd century BC. In other words, the time when the Romans were conquering Greece and taking back their money, their art, their books, and their people as slaves. And soon after, Rome fell in love with everything Greek. As Horace described it, the conquered took the conqueror captive, which is perhaps a bit of a rosy imperialist outlook, but still it's true in many ways. What is clear from the House of the Faun is that even in a place like Pompeii, a small city and ally of Rome, people were doing quite well and falling under the sway of all things Greek. First, the house is huge. Here you can see, from the blackened rectangle on the map, that it takes up an entire city block. A block is sometimes called an insula, Latin for island, and you can see the way it would have existed as a little island within the city. There are only a few houses this big in Pompeii, roughly 32,000 square feet. If we turn back to the plan, and I include this model as well because it gives you a sense of how much of the original house would have been roofed. Remember, the roofs all caved in with the fall of the pumice during the eruption. It's a little deceiving, in fact, to walk around Pompeii now and think that the houses were all open to the sky. That would have really only been true of the garden and atrium spaces. But the plan gives you a good sense of the vastness of space. The main entrance is at 1, leading into the atrium at 3, and there are 2 back gardens with columned porticos around them that really take up the bulk of the square footage of the house. The porticos and the gardens represent the real luxury partially influenced by Greek models. There are a number of spaces, most notably at 18, that look onto these gardens, which are sumptuously decorated and are where the host and his guests would have sat to talk or perhaps have dinner as they looked out onto a garden. The entranceway at 9 leading into atrium 10 would have probably been a whole separate space for slaves who served the household. Here's the main entrance at number 1. It's about 18 feet high and would have had huge wooden doors, much larger than the little green ones we see here. They would have been open during the day so that people could get a glimpse of the vista within the house and be suitably impressed. After all, showing your wealth and creating envy were a popular Roman pastime. Here's the welcome mat. Have, Latin for hello or welcome, as in Ave Maria. It's set in mosaic tile in the sidewalk outside this house. This has always struck me as curiously unimpressive, given what we see of the house inside. It does show us, though, a couple of things. First, it shows the owner using Latin in the 2nd century BC. In other words, before Sulla settles his troops here, and the town becomes an official Roman colony. So clearly Latin was already an important language, perhaps even dominant among the wealthy. I will say, though, that this follows the assumption that the highway here occurs at roughly the same time as the rest of the building, and I don't know how the archaeologists would necessarily determine that or be so sure of that. The other thing, though, that it shows us that's very interesting is that the Pompeians tend to aspirate their Latin. They include that H before a word, which in classical Latin would simply be awe. They clearly pronounced it hawe. So they speak their Latin with a bit of a local accent, and we see this popping up with some other words in the graffiti of Pompeii. Once in the front door, the grandness of the house comes across in the decoration of the entranceway. The walls are in fact plastered, and you can see where the plaster ends and where the cement layer below it exists right at the bottom of this slide. But most of the walls would have been plastered, and then this one you can see is painted with a design that looks like expensive blocks of colored marble. And in fact, it rises to a second floor with a ledge and columns and doorway. Except that I'm pretty sure that this is an entirely faux second floor. This is one of the things I love about the Romans. They go to great expense to create an impression of something that would have cost them even more if they had made it real. The painted marble blocks and the fake second floor were not cheap to create in the first place, but they're certainly cheaper than actually having the real thing. And everyone goes away suitably impressed anyway. Here is the faun, who's now very tarnished. He originally would have been a bright golden bronzy color. This is a copy, by the way. The original is in the museum in Naples, and in fact is a little bit larger than this one. If we're thinking of him in his original terms, you'd have to imagine him in the rays of the sun streaming through the impluvium in the roof of the otherwise darkened atrium, with the water rippling in the compluvium pool around him. And suddenly, it probably looked like he was really dancing. I think it would have been a very kind of cinematic or almost theatrical scene to see the light streaming in down on him very sharply and brightly, to see the ripples of the water. It would have come alive in a way that perhaps is a little difficult to imagine now. So far, a very grand house. As I was saying before, though, the real luxury is in the space devoted to the gardens, the columned walkways, and the rooms that open off of this space. Look closely, though, here. Can you see how the columns are made out of brick and are plastered over to make them look like marble? Again, we see this Pompeian penchant go for facade architecture. It's much cheaper to do this than to construct columns out of solid blocks of stone. Interestingly, we can see this exact same technique, constructing the core of the column out of bricks and plastering it over to make it look like marble on top. We can see this technique for the columns of one of the fanciest buildings in the city, the Basilica, in the Forum. So even in that case, where probably the community of Pompeii could have afforded something more expensive with a building like the Basilica, they chose not to do it. They chose to be frugal and pragmatic. Finally, we come to one of the most breathtaking mosaics in all of the ancient Roman world. It originally existed in the floor of room 18 of the House of the Faun. It was 19 feet by 10 feet. And Beard tells us that it was made up of between 1.5 and 5 million colored pieces of stone, though why we haven't come up with a more accurate count, I don't quite know. It shows the Greek king Alexander leading the charge against the Persian king Darius, an historical event from Alexander's march and conquering eastward that he actually may have commissioned originally as a painting. We know that he had painters who came along on his expedition. Here you can see Alexander and his famous horse Bucephalus. Don't they look alike in profile? Wavy hair, ears prominently displayed. You can see the whites of their eye. Here they're charging and spearing. Alexander is spearing a Persian soldier in front of Darius. Darius looks afraid and gestures in sympathy out towards the stricken soldier, while the man behind him whips the rest of the army to the fight. A very tyrannical and un-Greek move. And the Greeks often like to draw this contrast between themselves and the Persians, between people who were sort of more enlightened and had a democratic past, and people who had to whip their armies into fighting. The man in front of Darius tries to control a rearing horse. And if you've ever seen this mosaic on the wall at the museum in Naples, it may seem a strange choice of the artist to have your eye drawn so centrally to the back end of a horse. This is an unfortunate result of it being placed on a wall. It was originally on the floor in the House of the Faun, and thus the viewer couldn't ever get more than 5 feet or so away from it. The horse would have dominated the ancient view much less. The real fascinating part of this mosaic comes in the depiction of the fallen Persian below the horse. You see him in the reflection of his shield, looking stoic in the face of his imminent death. This has always struck me as one of the great virtues of the classical world. Namely, though life could be harsh, and both Greeks and Romans could be ruthless, militaristic societies, they also show a consistent interest and sympathy in the circumstances of the defeated. Think about how heroic and central Hector is in the Iliad. Or in Roman culture, think, for example, of Horace's Cleopatra ode, and how noble and philosophical she comes across in her defeat. I think we see that here as well, the recognition of the way in which we are all human in the face of death. And so I think maybe this is something else that the Pompeians get from the Romans as the Hellenistic world is expanding and Rome is taking in all this Greek stuff. They get an enlarged, deepened sense that comes through the Hellenistic, comes through especially the Greek side of things. And this is another great benefit that perhaps is evident in the House of the Faun. Okay, thanks a lot.